What is going on, everybody? It is your boy, the Big Signorelli, and you are watching the Parallax Viewer. So, this is our third installment for the Seminar 16 series titled From an Other to the Other. And if you watch the first two, they were simply just read along exegesis videos because well, I didn't want to put too much pressure on me in the very first few installments. I also didn't want to make it so boring and crude and just be a read along. But at the same time, I felt like there was a lot of information, and yet those seminar chapters were just so short that I could have just read them and make it easier on myself while I built up the lecture slash presentation that I wanted to give for this specific topic. And this is going to cover not only a big portion of the first section, the crucial portion of the first section, the topology of the other, but also going to be a sneak peek on a future writing project that I am in the process of working on currently. But needless to say, I didn't want to leave y'all hanging. And I think it's really important for me, with my own uh, drive and determination to keep the momentum and consistency going. So I said, fuck it, we're just going to do it now. So, what is crucial about this section? Well, Lacan gives us what I believe are the three most crucial um, points with regards to his teaching in Seminar 16. Now, flashback. This is given at a time during the aftermath of the failures of May 68. Because of the failures of this you could say communist revolution, which resulted in, an appeasement into sort of uh, democratic reforms, etc. And again, my history is not as good as someone as like, I'd say Daniel Tutt, and I would recommend watching. I'll link it in there. The study group that we did on Seminar 16, and I really like the way that he orients the historical context from a historical materialist perspective regarding the focal point of the seminar. But many of these students were caught in confusion and despair, hystericized by Lacan by saying, what you aim at is a master. You will get one. And this has to deal with his understanding of revolution because he doesn't think of it as a legit sort of transformation and the sort of political climate that he is around with French Marxism. Um, that really revolution for him is like in the same way that planetary orbit revolves. It always returns back to its same place. And many Marxist intellectuals, or many intellectuals that had some sort of Marxist tendencies or affinities with the PCF, and it wasn't even just this moment too. It was also the Sino-Soviet split that caused this. It caused a lot of um, people to in the party and those who were intellectuals in Paris and in France that had some Marxist leanings to reject Marxism or to reject the party and take on different nuanced aesthetics or countercultural movements. We could look at someone who flirted with communism at a certain point, and Gabriel Rockwell's good at this, is at exploiting the um, flirtation of communism, but ultimately anti-communist, anti-Marxist agenda was Michel Foucault. Someone like Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari would also have a critical distance from the French Parisian Marxist milieu, um, Baudrillard, etc. The list goes on. And Lacan's seminar will be pivotal because not only, and this is paradoxically, not only will he reiterate, um, you know, concepts and tropes that you all are familiar with, like desire is the desire of the other, jouissance, the barred subject, the unconscious, the drive, etc., from as early as the 1950s. He will bring it back in a big way. And in a very harsh way, especially given the fact that most of the audience members are not just the psychoanalysts that he is teaching and fortifying their analytic vocation, but also Marxist intellectuals that are curious what Lacan may prescribe regarding uh, theories of emancipation. Um, that being said, the other aspect which makes this seminar sort of uh, paradoxical with the fact that not only is he reiterating things that he's already talked about, he's also bringing a new novelty to the topology regarding uh, the subject of the unconscious and the fact that the unconscious is the discourse of the other and the subject is othered and dealing with the other. And we'll see the relationship between big other, capital O, and little other, small o, which is synonymous with the little a, the objet a, which in later sessions I will talk about. Needless to say, the 3 points that I want to orient this lecture and this presentation on are dealing with the novelty in which Lacan's psychoanalytic teaching and discourse orient around. The first one is the fact that structure does not equal structuralism. And he wants to separate himself from the term structuralism. Recall the first chapter that we read, that the university as a discourse and as ultimately um, a part of the knowledge market will label all that they can under an umbrella of terms only to alienate intellectuals or to lump them up into the trash discourse or what he calls publication. So then, what is structure? He says it very bluntly. Structure is the realist, or structure is what is most real, because structure ultimately converges towards its own impossibility, right? And two, this actually goes earlier from that first thing, but I want to highlight that because I think that is crucially important. Because he first iterates that psychoanalysis and its essence um, is ultimately a discourse without speech, a discourse without words. And this ties in with structure is the most real. And not only is structure the most real, and psychoanalytic theory uh, dealing with a discourse or a structure without speech or words um, converges not only towards its own impossibility, but as a discourse, aim at the cause of discourse as such. So those are my 2 points, right? Or let me do the German too. Structure is the real, or the most realist. Psychoanalytic discourse, insofar as it is a discourse without speech or words, also aims at the cause of discourse as such. And the last one deals with the way in which this can be formalized through set a homology between the logic of the signifier, which is ultimately an impasse at the side of formalization, and this homology with the logic of the signifier with the Russell set theory paradox, um, to point at the impasse of the signifier and the subject, but also to point at what psychoanalysis shows within the emergence of not only the signifier, but the subject as such that aims at the cause of discourse as such, which is, and that was a mouthful, also the site of primal repression. The original moment in which the subject aims at the cause of discourse as such, or aims at the field of knowledge guaranteed by the big other, ultimately ends up at an impasse. And this impasse is none other than the primordial moment, the ontogenetic reconstruction of primal repression. So we're gonna take it step by step. Right. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Where did it go? This is weird. Huh. Interesting. I thought I had this whiteboard, the existing one. Give me one sec. Technical errors. Okay. Well, I think we can make this work. Let's see. Yeah, this could work. Let me just use my pen. So, right here, look at the shitty 2. So these right here are whole numbers, right? And we'll put them in a box, right? Very crooked. Now this, if you've read Seminar 14, there we go. If you've seen Seminar 14, so this is my existing one. He has this listed on, I want to say the first or second, I think the second chapter, um, which says on the bottom of the whiteboard, he has some lady draw it out too, which is funny. Um, and it says underneath the box that the smallest whole number, which is not written on the board. So I have 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are whole numbers. So what is the smallest whole number then? It's 5. But then we would put that in there, and now it would be 6, right? And so in this sort of niche way, what he's building that is set theory. He's trying to talk about sets, right? And why this is important is because this has to do with what is called a universe of discourse, right? And what sets are ultimately are universes of discourse, right? It is a mathematical logic trying to incorporate sort of meta language, you could say, through a universe of discourse. And so what we have are sets, which ultimately contain elements, elements that do not represent themselves. So we can say that we got, you know, X, right? This is a notation builder. X is just a variable. We can say X is the element. Ooh, that did not work out well. So we could say that X is the element of A, right? And this is just one element, right? Maybe we could say we have X, Y, Z, right? And they can all be encompassed by set A, right? And the same thing that I did earlier with that first example, let's say set A was a simply uh, you know, the sum or the total of all integers minus the smallest integer not in the box, right? Which would be, or whole number, which would be 5, right? Right. These are just in a way just formalization or just certain formalisms to talk about sets, right? Now, it gets more complicated because this is just an average set, right? And I'm still studying set theory, so bear with me if I butcher some of the notations and some of the definitions of the concepts. But there's what's called a um, closed set, and then what is called the shit open set, where more can be added in there, right? And so the biggest things about sets from the classical Cantorian and I want to say even Fregean sense is that sets only contain members that do not contain themselves, or elements that do not contain themselves, right? So you could write it as uh, X is a member. I hate when this does that. Bear with me. I was ready to do this, but I was not accounting for the technical difficulties. X is an element of A insofar as X does not contain itself. And so, Jesus, I don't know why that does that. So the way you would write it in set notation theory um, would be boom, right? There's your little element with a little slash, bam. And I should probably put this. So this is a sort of notation builder of saying X is an element of set A insofar as X is not an element to itself, meaning that X cannot contain itself or relate to itself. It needs to be contained by something. So A, very simple, right? Done deal, cut and clean. Russell comes along and challenges this, right? So he talks about, and again, I'm gonna switch up the notations because I want to use exactly what Lacan shows in seminar 14, and then you'll see how we arrive at these points that I mentioned in seminar 16. So we could say that, for instance, and these are the examples he uses, um, Y, that's a very terrible Y, is an element of set B, right? Done deal. So B is a set. And on the bottom, I'll put another notation where he says, yes, or actually, I don't even do that. So we got that right here. Y is, an element of set B. And yet we could also have another set in which Y can also be contained by another set, right? And let's say we have two sets. So we have set B and set A. And somehow Y can also Y could also be contained by A. So we have Y, bam, and set A. That was terrible. And that's fine, so long as Y does not contain itself. So we could have, hopefully I'm not jumping so far. So we could have two sets, right? And both sets can be in unison so far as they contain a certain variable, so long as these variables, again, do not contain themselves. Because again, elements or variables do not represent themselves. Sets, by definition, contain or represent elements or members insofar as those elements and members do not contain themselves. So then Russell comes along and talks about the set of all sets, right? So we'll use the Russell Lacanian example of, okay, so you have two sets, B and A, right? Which one is the open and which one is the closed one? All right, so we'll figure this out. So he says, okay, bet, what if we have B as an element of set B? Because we're talking about the superset, the set that will contain all sets that do not contain themselves, because sets don't contain themselves. They contain elements or members that do not contain themselves, right? And then he has another notation of B as an element of A insofar as B does not contain itself. Shitty B, but you get the point. So what is going on here? We've already said that sets contain members that do not contain themselves. And members, or in other terms, elements, numbers, whatever, are those that need to be contained because they do not contain themselves. So this one says right here that B is an element of B, right? But wait, this set only contains things that do not contain themselves. So then he also writes B is an element of set A, which is fine. That works, right? This set can contain A insofar as B does not contain itself. So what does this show? It shows that, well, one, that we either fail the definition, uh, can't meet its logical conclusion, and also that its function cannot be met as well. This is the whole thing of the Russell set. And to put it simply, what the set of all sets would entail is a meta language which would encapsulate a universe of discourse, because set theoretical mathematics is a mathematical logic that tries to encapsulate the logic of, you could say, pure thought. It's like pure mathematics, right? And operating on the intuitions at its elemental form, abstract from crude empirical reality, etc., think Kant, a pure mathematics, we are trying to aim at a sort of totality. And this totality of a universe of discourse is one in which logic, rules of language, and the mathematics married together. And yet what we have is an impasse at the site of formalization, right? So I showed you all that for a good reason, and thank you for um, humoring it. I probably bastardize a lot, but it's okay. The writing will be a lot better. All right. So I'm clearing all drawings. So why do I say that, right? Because again, structure is the real or the most real because it converges towards its own impossibility. And what we're dealing with is discourse psychoanalysis, which is without words or speech. We're dealing with writing and uh, formalization, and an impasse at the side of formalization, which is ultimately what we're trying to get at is a topology of the unconscious, right? And also a topology of jouissance. And the topology of jouissance is also the topology of the split subject, right? Because again, this other thing that was mentioned right after the fact that structure is the most real and it converges towards its own impossibility, but also that it aims at the cause of its own discourse. So what causes the discourse? Well, it's the subject, and the subject is split between knowledge and truth. Read Science and Truth by Lacan and the Accrete. So this subject, right, is split by its own discourse. So it aims at truth, right? And so to cause this discourse, it needs language, which would be this S1, this signifier, right? And he puts it this way: aims, boom. Think you all are familiar with this. What does that look like? So what you have is the cause of discourse as such, a subject that is ultimately split between knowledge and its own truth. So this is the condition to which a representative aims at this, which ultimately all this is just a chain of knowledge. 3. Now, I don't want you to get fooled, because when a lot of times when we think of these signifiers, S1, S2, and S3, etc., the list could go on, it does not mean that we are counting whole numbers like, oh, we got S1 is the very first signifier, S2 is the second signifier, S3. No, that's not how it works, right? These are already notations of impasses, so I'm already going too far. But we got this chain, and this chain of knowledge could keep going. Again, this is almost like the open set, and this is a closed set, right? So how does this relate to the Russell's paradox, and how does this relate to these things that I'm talking about, especially with the points? So we'll see how structure is the realist, how we're aiming at our own impossibility. I'm already showing you why it's a discourse without words, because this is what we're using, right? And ultimately how this relates to primal repression. So let me clear this again. So the signifier, right? The logic of the signifier, right, is that the signifier S1 represents the subject barred S to, Jesus Christ, another signifier. So I could have just left this, but I don't care. I wanted to reiterate something. So we have $ subject to another signifier, S2. So here's the thing, right? Bam, bam, bam. Let's look at this again. The signifier represents the subject for another signifier. So this signifier, and we'll put our ordered pairs, is S. And what is this right here? It's nothing but A, the big other, which ultimately would be what this S2 is, a chain of knowledge. So what we have right here is a subject that ultimately is not present in discourse, but is absent, but at the same time is the cause of such discourse, to which it needs to be represented in its absence by a signifier, right? An S. So this S right here is going to be the set in which S1 and barred S are, because the signifier represents the subject. But here's the thing. The signifier is not a Saussurian subject in which we have the signified on top and the signifier on the bottom, right? It is not that classical example of this sort of little s and big S at the bottom, right? We've gotten rid of that, right? Because we are privileging the signifier and not the signified. And what the signifier does is a series of differentiation, which is like Saussure. And I said this last time, that the signifier gets its meaning through another signifier, differentiation, right? So no signifier can represent itself or refer to itself from its own for its own meaning, right? So not only does the signifier represent the subject, the signifier cannot get its meaning by itself. It needs another signifier, right? So the signifier right here is not getting its meaning from the subject. The signifier gets its meaning from this chain of differentiation, which is S2, and ultimately in this process, representing what is absent, the subject, right? So we are left with a choice within these two um, ordered pairs. So I'm going to clear all my drawings. So which is S, which would represent the set of S1 and barred subject. And then we have A, which is the open set of, say, S. Well, it's going to be actually. So in a sense, there is a unison, right, of S1, S2, Jesus. S3, and ad infinitum. It could go on, but ultimately it will have to keep, Jesus, it will have to keep going. It would have to come to a conclusion somehow, right? So this S1, of course, as a part of this closed set, in a sense, represents the subject, right? Done deal. But where does the signifier then get its meaning from? Because this S1 is all alone, this S, right? So it must get its meaning from another set of signifiers, right? But if it keeps going on, where is the last signifier at to totally get its meaning, right? Because we could just keep going on and on and on. If I stop at 5, all right, so S1 could get its meaning from 2, and 2 could get its meaning maybe from 3, and back and forth, right? This retroactive thing. But this retroaction can only happen so far as that, well, we could go on and on and on and on, but something is going to be left out. Who is going to get its meaning from what, right? But then also, we're left with the choice of, is it getting its meaning, or is it also representing the subject that is not there? So we're forced with a dilemma, because are we dealing with meaning and differentiation, or are we also dealing with the representative for the subject that is absent, right? And ultimately, the Russell's paradox looks like this, because what A really is S going to A, right? It's this set meeting that set, right? But what is this? Universe of discourse. It's A, because the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, right? But what is this A? Oh my God, it's nothing but S meeting A. That arrow will do. It's S meeting A, right? And it goes on and on and on. We're stuck with the problem. And this keeps happening because, well, S is trying to represent the subject, but also trying to close the set of all meaning insofar as it represents the subject. Because this is an open set and this is a closed set, and yet at the same time, they share a sort of unision because of the fact of S1. And S1 all alone in this closed set does not have any meaning. It's only representing the subject. So this is the stand-in for this little bad boy that represents its absence and also the cause of discourse, right? The subject is split by truth and knowledge, the truth of its own discourse and the knowledge that is produced from it, right? So the forced choice is to reiterate that the signifier represent the subject, or does the signifier uh, relate to other signifiers for its own meaning? Well, it's both, right? But insofar as it does that, we're left with the Russell's paradox, because we can never have a totalized discourse, a totalized discourse insofar as that we cannot have a universe of discourse or a meta language. So A cannot be complete. This means that there is no signifier, because sure, we could have the signifier that represents the subject, but we have no final signifier that would enclose the entire field of meaning and knowledge. So there is no signifier to represent the field of meaning, the field of knowledge, the field of discourse, the field of the big other. So how does this relate to the final point? This is the site of primal repression because when the baby is with the other, right, it is caught in a dynamic loop of demand, right? And within the demand, there is enunciation from the other as I, right? But there's a moment in which, and this is the key thing, right? That the child encounters a gap, not just an inconsistency in the other's eyes in relation to the metonymic demand of the child, but also something in which there encounters a gap, right? In which enunciations cannot meet the demand, right? And in which the demand turns into what am I for the other, right? Because we hear about desire is the desire of the other, and I recognize um, that as a neurotic, as a castrated subject, that I uh, lack something and the other has it, and I want that. But the primordial thing in the ontogenetic reconstruction of the primal repression is what am I for the other, right? The interrogation of a subject not necessarily split, but caught within a metonymic of demands, and the demand goes into what am I for the other, that we get signifiers, right? That displace the metonymic chain so that we end up with, again, this sequence of S as a signifier interrogating, A, the field of the other, insofar as there are other signifiers, and we end up in this loop, right? This is primal repression. This child ends up in this constant loop. And so the importance of castration is to stop that so that we get a barred subject and we get an S1. You see, we're only retroactively going back and inscribing S1. But prior to that, we have a subject and just any signifier, a chain of signifiers. So S1 marks the the site of the impasse formalization. S1 marks the um, primordial impasse of that. So S1 isn't the very first signifier, but it is a signifier that will latch onto in this metonymic demand to split the subject, the subject splitting itself, to then create an unconscious, dang, why did I put a square? To create an unconscious discourse that would be the unconscious, like I said, of this repetition, right? Bam, of this. And how does this come about? Or you should say, what will this lead to, right? What is the product? What is the product that happens from this impasse? Let me fix this. Well, if you're catching my drift, it is a remainder. Jesus Christ, this pen sucks. It is the little a, right? It is plus de jouir. Why is it doing that? I cannot get a little a. Anyhow, maybe that is the rupture of the other. This is pissing me the fuck off. Um, I should stop using the smart pen in this instance and just draw myself. Bam. So this is the little a. I just drew the master's discourse for you, but we're not going to go there yet. We're going to wait until seminar 14, or sorry, seminar 17 to really talk about this discourse. But this is what he's building up at. We don't get this on its own. We get this from this onto genetic makeup of primal repression. And secondary repression or castration and the phallic function splits us into alienated, castrated subjects to which the S1 and the way that the S1 relates to a unary trait, a mark, that there is a mark from this moment that would create a repetition, which is ultimately aligned with jouissance, a whole, a leftover, a remainder. And this remainder is ultimately not only what inaugurates us as subjects in society, this surplus jouissance, but also relates back to what this impasse ultimately is of mastering the metonymic demands of what am I for the other, right? What am I? And can this signifier plug in the inconsistency and the gap in the other? The neurotic, right, and the pervert both see inconsistency, right, and even the gap, but the neurotic represses it. Whereas the pervert will disavow it and try to make itself the instrument of the other's enjoyment by being a sort of inversion, by being the instrument of enjoyment of the lost, of objet a, and plugging in the lack in the other, by bearing the true faith. We will see this relate to Pascal's wager in the future, right? And again, I I think the downfall of this presentation would be the fact that I'm not as savvy with this whiteboard stuff, but I'm not going to dox myself too much to complain. And is a work in progress, but ultimately this is what we're dealing with, right? This Russell's paradox, which according to Lacan is not a paradox because we could write it. It only becomes a paradox when we start to speak it, because this is something I've talked about in many other presentations and interviews, that there's a difference between formalism and formalization. And this is a key point that I got from Paris Lavidis, that formalism is just the mathematical notations, but formalization is putting it into a discourse in which we not only write about it, but we exchange signifiers to create a universe of discourse that can be talked about and enclose all of language, right? It could be the language for the language. Um, and that's not the case, right? In the same way, in the level of the unconscious, what we're trying to do is be the other for the other, right? And we're left is with a remainder from this process insofar as that the result of this impasse leads to the castrating function, to avoid this metonymic loop, right? This is the function of the signifier insofar as that the signifier has the function of what was it, the name of the father, and the name of the father is the signifier of all signifiers that emerges in the Oedipal complex, right? That would inaugurate us as sexualized subjects, and also castrate us from this metonymic demand of barring the A insofar as that we're lost in the what is it, the dosting of the other. And it's I mention that because even though I have gripes with that term and the way it's used, there is a good revision of it in this seminar that will come up way, way later, right? But the point is that this is what the impossibility is. The impossibility of pretty much enclosing discourse, even though it causes discourse, its impossibility folds onto itself because the truth of it is that it's split between um, its condition, which is knowledge, and we could even think of it as cause, right? Cause of its own discourse, and the effect. And the effect, right, is that there's always a remainder because of the impotence and impossibility of enclosing that. We just constantly end up in a series of loops. This loop, which we see and better yet, oh God, this was terrible. I don't have the smart thing on. Shit. Goddamn. That was terrible. Bear with me. S and A. Bam. And it just keeps going and going and going and going, right? Let's clear it all. Bam. And so from that, we then can get this. Let's see. I don't know why this happens. How do you get a triangle from an S? That is the inconsistency of the other. Bam. Right? This logic of the signifier is so important to Lacan because, again, it goes back to this fundamental problem of the subject, representation, and the representative. Or, sorry, between how? How, Sway? How does that happen? So, what we see here is ultimately the split knowledge and truth, right? And the split of the signifier representing the subject and the signifier uh, relating to other signifiers, not only for its meaning, but also to enclose that field which is the A, right? And that relates to, again, the Russell's paradox. Um, this will, no matter what, this will always be a thing for Lacan. Like, I think that it's so important, and I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna stop sharing because I don't think we need to go that far anymore. What I wanted to show from that is that this is how we do psychoanalysis as a discourse without speech. Of course, I was talking, but I didn't have to show the unconscious by purely speaking. I showed the formalization, which is an impasse, through writing, through a topology, right? And so this loss um, and this remainder are jouissance, right? And we'll get to that later, but the point of this was to show ultimately how structure is the realist because it converges towards its impossibility. And insofar as that psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech, also is a discourse that aims at the cause of discourse, right? The cause of discourse is the subject, right? But what was the subject doing? The subject is absent. And I forgot that the subject is inaugurated at this primordial moment in primal repression, right? When it's not like, okay, there's a pure subject that wasn't split, right? What we have is a child, and insofar as that it's caught within a field of metonymic demand, a signifier is put in place to stop that. But insofar as that when it encounters the other who enunciates those demands through signifier, because the other is the field of language of meaning, right? Imposes these demands into um, signification, then reverses it into what am I for the other, right? And that inconsistency in the gap, because the inconsistency can come from the fact that sometimes what the other does insofar as that it enunciates signifiers back or signification, it doesn't meet the demand, right? It doesn't it doesn't help within that loop. And so then the inconsistency then will turn into a gap, a hole, and especially in the crude example of uh you know oh, she has a desire, mother has a desire, and she doesn't desire me. She desires daddy. Daddy must have the phallus, but I don't have the phallus, right? So this goes back to something that is not only talked about in Freud with the Oedipus complex, but also something that will be talked about in seminars 4 and 5, right? And we shouldn't let go of these early seminars. Again, I think it doubles down to the first point I made about reiterating familiar tropes and concepts, but using topology this time to talk about it. And because ultimately the unconscious, sure, as clinicians, we could see ruptures in speech. We could see the unconscious manifest through transference and the alienation that happens within transference in these linguistic crisscrossings of an enum. But this doesn't give us, something to play with insofar as we're teaching. And so what Lacan is trying to do is teach psychoanalysis. Then the next program or the next installment, I want to show how this sort of relates not only to, again, psychoanalytic practice, but also how it relates to what he will call the absolutization of the market and how Pascal emerges into this and what this wager entails. Thank you for humoring my technological difficulties. I'm displaying my Luddite mentality, but needless to say, I think I'm a little satisfied with how this played out because, like I said, I didn't want to continue doing readings line by line because there's no. I could talk about it and pause, but that gets old. And even though I don't care about the demands of the algorithm, not I can't assume that everybody has the same attention span, as one person. And maybe some people will think that oh, I don't have the attention span for this. So it's a matter of switching it up and everybody has a learning pedigree and I want to do as much as I can to cater to that. And I like the whiteboard thing because I learned that from Sam McCormick and he's an OG at that. Um, but stay tuned because I'm also going to do interviews with this and it's an entire project. It's a project not only for me as an autodidactic in psychoanalytic theory, specifically Lacanian theory, but also for this channel and people that are eager to learn Lacan and want to understand what the fuck this is about, but also maybe need some more meat and some more substance that they're not getting from these other sources. And I don't plan on being the source of the source, but I want to do my best to do diligence and to, come from all different angles. And to me, the topology is so important. So, again, thank you all. Enjoy your symptom and have a good night. Peace out, y'all.